Good morning, everyone. I'm Ben, and this morning I just wanted to spend a bit of time thinking with you about extremism. We've recently seen it in a few places in the world, in Beirut and Paris, and I want to think through extremism in the light of today's Bible passage that's just been read out. Before we get to the Bible, though, considering the context that we're in our world, how could anybody think that it's a good idea to promise to raise your child to be absolutely committed to the views of any religion? That's what we've seen this morning, isn't it? We've seen two parents committing to raising Harrison to be absolutely committed to the views of Christianity. It could seem a little bit inappropriate given the way that extreme religious views have led to the recent horrific loss of life. How can it be good for someone to be absolutely committed to views that are held in books that seem so distant from our modern culture? If Tom and Susan are successful in their promises, won't Harrison become an extremist? A Christian extremist or something like that? What is it exactly that we're signing up for when we say that we want to become a Christian? What would it be like for someone to unreservedly hold on to biblical Christianity? What does a Christian extremist look like? Would they take up arms against people from other religions? Maybe they would declare war against atheists. If Christians are people who know that they're going to heaven when they die, what would stop them strapping explosives to themselves to massacre their enemies? That's what we want to spend some time thinking about this morning, very carefully. We'll hear what God's opinion is on what the Christian life should look like at its most extreme. We'll see what the radical Christian life looks like. It might be helpful for you to keep the little outline open that you've been handed, and just in the middle there you'll see a bit of a brief outline of what we're thinking about, and also to keep your Bible open. So the first thing I want to do, though, is remind you of where we're up to in our current series of sermons. Last week we returned to our series of talks on Paul's letter to the Romans, and the Bible just calls this letter Romans. And Huey started us off by thinking again about Romans chapter 12. And today we'll sort of just be finishing off chapter 12. It's a bit of a sequel to last week's sermon. So let's do a quick flashback to how Romans 12 started. In your Bibles, it's on page 947 in the Red Pew Bibles. And we'll just have a look at verse 1 quickly, and then we'll get to today's passage. It'd be worth having it open in front of you so that you can make sure that I'm not lying or mistaken about what it says. Look down at verse 1 there, chapter 12, verse 1, where he tells the Romans what he wants them to do. He says, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." What's he saying there? Well, Paul wants us, by God's mercy, to offer our lives to God. He wants us to recognise how merciful God has been to us, and for that mercy to empower us to obey God, to offer him our whole lives, holy and acceptable to God. That's what Christian worship is. God's mercy to us empowers us to worship God. And then from verses 3 to 8 last week, we saw that how God's mercy empowers us to be holy and blameless in the way that we treat one another. We have different strengths and weaknesses, but we're all one body, and so there's no real pecking order. So that's last week's passage, and this is the sequel to it this week. So we need to remember this week, verse 1, that God's mercy to us empowers us to worship God. Everything he commands us to do in chapter 12 is actually empowered by God's mercy. It's not a completely new passage we're looking at today, but if we forget verse 1, we'll end up thinking that God is asking us to do a lot and that we have to come up with the power to do it ourselves. God definitely asks us, a lot of us in today's passage, but the resources for obeying him come from his mercy to us. I hope that makes sense. The resources for obeying God's great commands are his great mercy. So back to our original question. What does it look like, or what does someone look like who's fanatically committed to the Bible's teaching? And why would we want that for Harrison or for anyone? Well, if you want to understand a fanatic or an extremist, you need to understand how they love. You need to understand what they love and how they love it. Because that's all extremism is about, love. Perhaps it's a love for your people, your nation, your faith, whatever it is, love drives extremism. And Romans 12 is a great description of what Christian love looks like. So if we can understand the love of a Christian extremist, we will understand them at their core. Ultimately, in the Bible, the greatest picture of Christian love is Christ himself and the love that he's shown to us. That great mercy that empowers us to worship God was Jesus' death for our sake. And everything in this passage is perfectly shown to us in Jesus and no one else. So let's get started at looking at Romans 12. And it starts by showing us that Christian love is consuming. This is point 2 in your outlines there. Christian love is consuming. So bushfires are an example of something that's consuming. They affect everything that they touch, don't they? Nothing is left the same after a bushfire passes through. So is that what Christian love is like? Is it consuming like that? Well, it starts down in verse 9. So have a look down in your Bibles at chapter 12, verse 9, where Paul starts. He rules out any idea that you can just perform a few actions and call it love. It's not merely external, but it's internal or emotional. Look at verse 9. He says, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, and hold fast to what is good." You see, Christian love, it's meant to be genuine or sincere. It can't just look like love. It has to be much deeper than that. You see, if you love this way, you'll also hate. Do you see that in the verse? You'll care so much about what's good that you'll have the opposite feeling about what's evil. If you love something, you abhor anything that opposes the thing that you love. And so this is Christian love. It sincerely hates evil and binds itself to what's good. See, it's consuming in the way that affects the way that we relate to what's good and what's evil. But the next way that Christian love is consuming, you can see down in verse 10. Here we see how Christian love affects our relationships. It affects us both individually and communally. Look at verse 10. "Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honour." You see, Christian love should be other person-centred. This is why I think we can't fully accept the saying that you need to learn to love yourself before you learn to love others. See, Christian love, it doesn't prioritise me or ourselves, it prioritises others. We're meant to treat others better than we treat ourselves. It's consuming. It affects all of our relationships, not just some of them, and not just me as an individual. But more than that, Christian love is also consuming because it comes from the Spirit and not from ourselves. Look down in verse 11 there. Verse 11 says, "Do not be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord." See, Christian love doesn't just happen by great effort. It's not simply a matter of us trying our hardest to love sincerely or trying really hard to hate what's evil or trying really hard to put other people first. It's impossible by our effort alone to reach those goals. We naturally prioritise ourselves. We tend to put people first when it reflects well on us. Maybe you put a lot of effort into your kids because you secretly want something for yourself. Maybe it's just you want to be a good mother and you love that idea more than you love your children. That's actually putting ourselves first. That's not sincere love. Maybe we want other people to see us as being a good parent and so we do it. That's not sincere love. It's putting ourselves first. Or you could even hate evil because evil has harmed you in the past. Evil has become your enemy. And so you might set yourself to combat evil in the world just because it's harmed you, and actually looking after yourself first again. But the source of Christian love, where it comes from, is that it's external, it's spiritual. Love is given by God's Spirit. The Spirit here in this verse, he sets us on fire. That's what the word fervent means. It's like this idea of boiling or burning. The Spirit consumes us. That's where Christian love comes from. It's God's Spirit that transforms us to honour others more than we honour ourselves, because God's Spirit shows us how he has honoured us more than we deserve. We can't forget what Paul had said back in chapter 12, verse 1. God's mercy to us empowers us to worship God. The power comes from God's acts of mercy, not from inside of us. Jesus once said that the Spirit would be a teacher. Now, there's a little quote from Jesus. He says, "These things I have spoken to you while I am still with you, but the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." The Spirit opens our eyes to understand reality from God's point of view. He helps us have a bigger perspective than narrowly focusing on ourselves. He enables us to love well. Here in Romans 12, he sets us on fire. We burn up inside because of the Spirit. It's a consuming love only available to people with God's Spirit. But finally, this Spirit-given consuming love, it also helps us to face suffering, whether it's our own suffering or the suffering and the needs of others. You can see that down in verses 12 and 13. He says, "Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality." See, bushfires, they are all-consuming. Everything they touch, trees and animals and homes, whatever bushfires touch, they consume. Nothing is left. And in the same way, Christian love affects every aspect of our lives. Can you see that it's starting to look a little bit like a form of extremism? It's not just a little compartment of our lives that it affects, not just the way that we act, but everything. Jesus said that this kind of love would be the thing that characterised Christians. He said, "By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another." If someone doesn't have this love, they can't really be called a disciple of Jesus. They're not Christians even if they say they are. Unlike a bushfire, which is destructive, this love is constructive. It doesn't just affect our actions, but it's genuine, and it deeply shifts the way that we feel about good and evil. It doesn't just affect us as individuals, but is other person-centred and reshapes our communities. And we don't create this love by our own strength, but it comes from the Spirit as he burns or boils in us. Christian love is just as much something that God does in us by his empowering mercy as it is something that we do ourselves. We're commanded here to do what God has promised to do in us. It's a great command. And it's exactly this kind of love that consumed Jesus, wasn't it? He was single-mindedly focused on doing good and abhorring evil. It affected every moment of his life. One easy example of it is when he was tested by the devil in the desert. He'd been starving and not eating for 40 days, and the devil invited him to worship the devil and eat, or be blessed in many different ways. But Jesus was absolutely committed to loving what is good and abhorring what is evil. He's done it in a way that we can never expect to do it ourselves. He's the perfect example of being consumed by this kind of love. The verses that we've just looked at, though, I think they raise a tricky and important question for us. We've looked at how love drives us to abhor evil or hate evil, right? What we've seen in Paris is a group of people actively hating what they think is evil. and they've set themselves to express their hatred by taking the lives of as many people as they can. So here's the question. Is Christian love fundamentally different to the love of ISIS? ISIS claim to love one thing and therefore hate everything that opposes it. Christians are called to love what is good and therefore hate everything that opposes it. Is Christian love any different to the love of ISIS? The answer can't just be that Christians mustn't hate, because we've just seen in verse 9 that hating evil is a necessary part of loving what's good. And Jesus also, he's our model of Christian love. We see his outright fury toward evil many times in the Bible. So what is the answer? Well, the first part of answering this very important question comes from the next few verses in the chapter, where we see that Christian love is critically and fundamentally different to the love of ISIS. Because, and this is the first thing, this is point 3 in your outlines, Christian love makes you anyone and everyone's ally. Christian love makes you anyone and everyone's ally. You see this in verses 14, 15 and 16, the next 3 verses. And they begin with explaining how we should treat people who are harassing or persecuting us. Now look down at verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Paul here, he's basically summarising what Jesus was teaching in Luke chapter 6. I'll read out Jesus' teaching because it puts a bit of flesh on what Paul's saying here. It's really worth seeing the perfected idea of this Christian love in Jesus. In Luke 6, Jesus says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from the one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. You'll be like God, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is evil." See, Paul, like Jesus, has no time for a type of love that is exclusively mutual, the kind of love that says, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. But even the people who harass you to the point of death, love them sincerely, genuinely. This is another reason that we need the Spirit to be able to have this Christian love. No one does this naturally. It has to have a supernatural source. People will do amazing things for their friends, where the thing that drives them is how much they value the relationship. But when the relationship is only a source of pain, you'll have people that you're tempted to curse. We've all got people who've made our lives hard. Maybe they've acted unspeakably cruelly to us. But the Christian response can never be to blow up their house, or shoot them, or to curse them. We're not to match them for cruelty. We're to find ways to benefit them, do them favours, take them meals, be their friend, lend them money and don't expect it back, feed them, bless them. It could be absolutely right to hate what they are and what they've done, but Christian love is so different to the love of ISIS, isn't it? It doesn't matter what they are to you and how they treat you, we're to be an ally to them. There's more to it in verse 15, if you see. We're to be allies with people through all of life's up and downs. It says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." Again, this is a sincere, genuine rejoicing and weeping. It's an expression of deep partnership with someone in their life. It's the product of love in the context of deep relationships, not superficial ones. I have some friends who don't go to this church they're deeply saddened at the moment because they're unable to have children. But at the same time, these particular guys are genuinely happy for their friends around them when they announce that they're pregnant. They go along to all of their friends' kids' birthday parties and they're genuinely happy for them. Yeah, they're sad because they'd love to have kids themselves, but I can see the Spirit powerfully at work in them, helping them not to obsess over themselves, but to be much more other person focused than I am, that's for sure. Other person-centered love doesn't just focus on my circumstances, but is deeply concerned for the community that we're a part of. So if someone is mourning here, don't tell them just to snap out of it. Don't try and just stop their sadness, but mourn with them. That's what Paul's saying. Feel what they're feeling. See it from their perspective. Pray for them and with them. And if someone's rejoicing while you're mourning, work hard to genuinely rejoice with them. Think of that other person more highly than you think of yourself. That's radical, isn't it? Christians aren't happy and smiling all the time. We're to be lovingly connected with one another in deep relationships, which naturally means mourning and rejoicing depending on other people's circumstances, not just our own. The idea that Christian love makes you anyone and everyone's ally, it doesn't just cover your friends and enemies or those who are mourning and rejoicing, but even people who are just annoying or below your social status or simple-minded people. Look down in verse 16. It says, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Church at Nine, this group of people, I think, is a group of people who do live in harmony with one another. I've only been here this year, but there aren't any great conflicts that I've seen. I think you do really well at this, so keep at it. Keep being willing to befriend and associate with people who are different to you, and not just superficially, but deeply. The opposite of this would be to start having a high view of ourselves. If we started looking down on others and when people walked in the door, we just worked out whether they were ranked higher or lower than us, inevitably that would just destroy harmony. I know that Huey does most of the upfront teaching here, so we could see him as being extra wise and extra important, and he is very wise. But let's not forget that every Christian has the spirit of wisdom. That's why we're all involved in teaching one another and building one another up. And that's why it would also be foolish to consider ourselves categorically wiser than other people who have that same spirit. See, Christian love makes us allies with anyone and everyone, whether they're our enemy, whether they're rejoicing or mourning, and regardless of any difference that we have with them. On January the 3rd, way back in 1777, it's about 250 years ago, there was a quick battle called the Battle of Princeton. George Washington's 4,500 men defeated Britain's 1,200 men in just a day. That was pretty much what we would expect. Only just less than 150 men lost their lives. What is remarkable, though, is that in the aftermath of the battle, Washington himself personally delivered 2 wounded British soldiers to his regimental surgeons, and he declared, I'll read out his quote, "Treat them with humanity and let them have no reason to complain of our copying the brutal example of the British Army in their treatment of our unfortunate brethren." It's sort of kind and harsh at the same time. But Washington, he ordered his men to treat these enemies as if they were allies. That's what our love ought to look like. I think the real challenge that comes from Paris isn't merely to see that Christian love is critically different from the terrorists' love. That's like comparing chalk and cheese. The real challenge is to, on the one hand, mourn and weep about the terrible loss of lives, but on the other hand, commit ourselves to being a blessing to the members of ISIS responsible for the attacks. We've got to commit ourselves to thinking, how can I bless the next group of terrorists still alive, ready to attack another city? Obviously, we have no interest in blessing their attacks And Paul goes on in verse 18 to fill it out more. He says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. The word all there is unqualified, it's unlimited. Live peaceably with absolutely everyone. But there is a recognition that peace isn't within our power alone. You may do everything you can to bless someone, to love them, but if they don't want peace, there won't be peace. We still seek peace as far as we can, so that even if it's only slightly possible, it will happen. When we look at our relationships and think there's only a 1% chance that relationship will be peaceful, it's an absolute long shot, that's what we commit ourselves to, is working for the 1%. We need to work hard to make that a reality. The next verse, though, is probably the most important in this section. And it's the most important reason that we shouldn't take revenge. Because revenge, or ultimately justice, belongs to God. Look down in verse 19. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. God has appointed the times when we will all live and die. He's determined if and when we will prosper and suffer. It's not ours to decide for someone else. And the heart of Christianity is the message that ultimately God has poured out his justice and vengeance, his revenge. He's poured that out on himself when Jesus was crucified. That's where the punishment was received for our crimes. That's the great mercy of God that we're meant to keep looking back to. Romans 12 helps us to be merciful to others. It's the beautiful fact that vengeance is the Lord's, but he's taken that vengeance on himself, the wrath on himself. But also, for everyone who rejects God's mercy now, there will be a time, either when they die in the future or if Jesus returns before that, there will be a time when God's vengeance and wrath will come down hard on them, unless they turn to God's mercy now. But regardless of what every individual does with God's mercy, we are never to be the ones who dish out God's vengeance. This is why Christians can never be like ISIS, pouring out Allah's wrath. Whenever someone claims to be the hand of God's judgment, it's not the God of the Bible. The end of verse 19 there, the idea that vengeance is mine, I will repay, that's a quote from Deuteronomy 32. This is a quote from the Old Testament God. The God of the Old and the New Testaments have the same view of revenge. Next week in Romans 13, we will see that God has human instruments for his justice now, and that's our governments. So come back next week for Romans 13. But for now, realise that as private individuals, we're not to carry out or even seek revenge against anyone. That's the context for the tricky verse that comes in verse 20 for us. We need to read verse 20 in the light of the 3 verses before it. Don't repay evil for evil, seek peace with everyone, don't avenge yourself, and look down at verse 20. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Again, there's another quote from the Old Testament. When ISIS claimed to worship and serve the God of the Old Testament, they've misunderstood him completely. He's the same God that we see revealed in Jesus, who prayed for the people who were crucifying him. He didn't lay down the lives of his enemies by defeating and crushing them, but Jesus laid down his own life to save his enemies. Our intention here isn't to heap burning coals on the heads of our enemies, but that will be the outcome if they repay evil for good. If you treat people who are blessing you as if they are your enemies, if someone is being good to you and you treat them as your enemy, you're already condemned. That's what an evil person does. Christians don't go around being nice to people so that they'll suffer. Our love has to be genuine. It's that impossible love that we don't have the power for in ourselves, that we're dependent on God's mercy and the Spirit for. It's not a fake love that looks impressive but actually intends to curse and intends to harm. That'd be a sneaky love, not a sincere love. But Christian love, it can recognise something as truly evil. We can see what's happened to our neighbours in France, or our neighbours in Beirut, our fellow human beings, and mourn with them for the great evil that they've suffered. But as private citizens, we're not to become vengeance toward terrorists. We're to be a blessing, to pray for them, that they'd be healthy, they'd have food and shelter, that their wives would deliver children safely and raise them well. Pray that they would turn to God for mercy now, while there's still time. That's what Christian extremism looks like. That's the kind of person that Tom and Susan have promised to be absolutely committed to teaching Harrison to be. And that's why we've all promised to help them. Christian love, Christian extremism, is far more radical than a kind of eye for an eye justice. Christian love is the extension of the mercy that God has shown to us when we were his enemies, when we crucified Jesus. It's an extension of that mercy to everyone around us, even our enemies. It's a love that can only be powered by God's mercy and Spirit, and a love perfected in Jesus' love for us. Let's beg God for help in having this extreme, radical, sincere love to make us the best kind of extremists. Let's pray.